This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast, number 79, Preaching. I am Hal Hammons, and I am a Citizen of Heaven, your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Here's what I have for you this week. A special episode like this one calls for special guests. Zeke Flores may be the best preacher I know. He's been a good friend for most of this millennium and has been working with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas for the last 7 years. When I think of local work, I think of Zeke. Andy Cantrell may be the best preacher I don't know. I do know his name always features prominently when preachers sing the praises of other preachers. A native of Southern California, he's been preaching in Champlin, Minnesota for 14 years. Let's start with what I've been preaching. Preachers like me are always telling listeners to take 1 John 4:1 seriously. Examine the words being spoken and the men speaking them. You would think that we would be experts ourselves, but speaking for myself, I'm not sure that's the case. How can we examine ourselves as preachers for doctrinal problems, and perhaps more importantly, for the attitude problems that might cause us to ignore them? Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
I entered preaching kind of late in life. I didn't start till I was 40 years old because I didn't become a Christian until I was in my 30s. And I had a glorified view of preaching. I thought that you just got up and waxed eloquent and people would just flock to hear the wise words that you had to say. And I realized that that wasn't the case. And then I realized that, wow, I had a whole lot to learn before I was able to even put two wise words together. It taught me the benefit or the value of making sure I know reasonably well, at least, what I'm talking about before I start to spew anything.
For me, examining myself before anybody else has to examine me, because that charge in 1 John 4 is to everybody, for them to test the spirits and test, like you said, what they're listening to, what's being taught. That's something that I have to take seriously for myself. I often think about what Paul wrote to Timothy about saving yourself and saving others. Mm-hmm. If what I tell people isn't the truth, then that's not going to help anybody. It's not going to help me either. If I'm thinking too much about what other people are saying about my preaching, or how other people are thinking about me as a preacher, whether they like it or whether they don't like it, whether, they want to listen to me or don't want to listen to me. If that's what I feel myself being concerned with, then I usually take a step back and say, well, what are you doing? Like, this isn't about putting on a performance or making people feel a certain way. This is about trying to equip them to do God's work and making sure they are the people they should be. My assessment usually is where my focus is if it's on how people feel about me and whether or not, did you like that lesson or not, then I need to reevaluate.
Early on, when I started preaching, I didn't really understand what my work was. I thought a lot of it was going to consist of flitting from house to house and talking to different folks. There's always a social aspect of being a preacher. But at some point, and I don't know when it was, an elder that I was speaking to said, never lose sight of how simple your work is. And it's contained in two broad categories. One is speaking words by which people can be saved. And the other is keeping the saved in a saved condition. And so, that goes along with evangelism and edification that we talk about a lot. I know those are broad categories, but it helped me to focus on understanding my work as a preacher. Now, I still flit from house to house and I talk to different folks, but that's just because I'm a Christian and I like people. 1 John 4:1 really places it there. He tells us that there are many false prophets that have gone out into the world, and my job is to make sure I'm not one of them. That I've got to, first of all, make sure that if I'm telling somebody how to be saved, that I've got to know that plan. I've got to know why it's important. I've also got to know what's important to keep someone in a saved condition after that.
Now, I started a lot earlier than Zeke did. I started in my mid-20s. And when you're a preacher, 25, 26 years old or whatever, you always feel like people are judging you. You always feel like people are doubting you. And you feel compelled to prove yourself. And when I look back at this now as a preacher in my 50s and I see preachers in their 20s, I can get a little bit of a chuckle out of that. But when you're in the middle of it, that is a really stressful kind of thing. And you don't want to show any kind of weakness. You don't want to show any kind of doubt. And I struggle with that because I'm trying always to learn. I'm trying always to push myself. And I don't want to give people the impression I don't have any convictions, because I do, but at the same time, I don't want to look arrogant either. So testing myself is a tricky kind of thing. Can you do it in such a way as to inspire confidence? Because you want them to have confidence in what you're saying. That's why you're up there saying it, right?
I think I completely understand what you're saying. I think I wrestled, especially during my early years of preaching, with all those kind of things. Like, I'm not the one that should be doing this. People know more than I do. But then temptations to sort of put on like I knew more than I did, all that.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the line, I feel like I think I just got past that when I realized it was okay to say sometimes, I don't know the answer to that. Like, I don't know how to talk about that yet. I'm not there yet with leading and teaching in those ways. But here's what I am confident of from Scripture. Here's what I know God has done in my life to help me. And so I just became more comfortable with that as time went on.
I think Hal brought up something that's important. At the beginning, you were talking about how younger preachers can sometimes feel insecure. It doesn't go away. I'm a geezer. I'm 60 years old, and I still have insecurities, and I have doubt, and I wonder how I'm going to be construed. And unfortunately, sometimes you will be misunderstood because people want to misunderstand you. Sometimes people will read things into your statements that aren't there at all. And sometimes you have to defend what it is that you say and what you preach. And the hard thing is to not let that turn into a resentment, right? Resentment against the very people that you're trying to help. You've heard that old joke about the wife who's trying to get her husband out of bed on Sunday morning. Come on, honey, it's time to get up and go to church. And he says, I don't want to go. I don't like those people and they don't like me. And she says, well, you have to go. You're the preacher. It can turn into that sometimes if we're not careful. We've got to develop a love for those that we're trying to help. And it's far more than that mushy affection that the world thinks it is. Of course, I know you guys know this, but it's a commitment. When we have come to work with a congregation, we are committed to that congregation. That's where our focus is. And we're going to love them, even as we ask them to love us, when sometimes we can be unlovable.
I think what you just said is really key. How do we examine ourselves? The question I have to always ask myself is, do I genuinely love these people? Do I love the people I'm talking to, whether they're Christians or whether they're the lost? Do I really love them? First Timothy, when Paul starts writing to Timothy, he tells Timothy right up front, that's the goal of our instruction. The goal of our instruction is love. And if you don't get that right, you end up talking about all kinds of nonsense that take you down rabbit trails and aren't productive and aren't helpful to the kingdom. But also over there in 1 John 4, that chapter, that whole context is about loving as God loved.
Right.
So how do we examine ourselves? Well, again, if I love people, not only am I going to be patient, am I going to be gentle, am I going to be kind in the way that I talk, but again, it has to be true. Like, what I teach them has to be from God. This isn't just about, like you said, Zeke, like whether or not we're all friends and we all get along. That's going to create troubles at times with people that aren't there for the right reasons. But I think when it's all said and done, what finally ends up happening in a group of God's people is those that are genuine begin to be seen.
Some of the best comments and support that I've gotten from my brethren here at Eastside are when I have preached lessons that for me were hard to preach, things that were hard and stepped on toes and all that kind of stuff, things that were just as difficult for people to hear as it was for me to say them, but they were needed. And that's another aspect of our work, is we've got to gauge the needs of our people and preach to those needs. They need to be told what to do to be saved and how to stay saved.
If we have the right kind of spirit, if we have the right kind of disposition, if we love the Lord, if we are striving toward good things, if we are trying as individuals, as preachers, to grow in our faith and our understanding, in a perfect world, at least, maybe not in the real world, but in a perfect world, these kind of issues of self-governance and self-examination and such will take care of themselves. We're not worried about leaving ourselves vulnerable to people because we got it wrong and they realize that we got it wrong and they pointed it out. We're okay with that. We want that. We want to be corrected. We don't fear that. We have this community of this family of believers that are mutually supportive. And in a worst case scenario, someone who is in fact caught up in error, someone who does have a rotten attitude or whatever, if that's exposed in the spirit of love, that can be a growth experience. That will be a growth experience, and we'll all be closer to the Lord. It'll be uncomfortable for a few minutes, but we'll get through this and move forward.
Yeah, I amen that. I think that's right.
One of the things that I see, I mean, all of what you just said, Hal, Paul did. And of course, there are a few examples that we can look to as far as to what a preacher ought to do and how he ought to exemplify all the best things in a man trying to expound the riches of Christ. Few can be better than Paul. When he was going through his trouble in prison, when he wrote to the Philippians, he said, I'm not there yet, but I still strive. I reach forward to what's ahead. He looked at his work of preaching the gospel as more than a job. And I fear that far too many preachers look at it as just that, as a job. In 1 Corinthians 9, he said, woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. And I identify that. I don't think there is another work that I can do that would be anywhere near as fulfilling and satisfying, in spite of the accompanying trouble that can come along with it, than preaching the gospel.
Well, let me poke into that a little bit before we close up, the idea of preaching being a job, because I can see this from a couple of different standpoints. I see people, without calling too many names, that probably would do better if they looked at preaching more as a job than they do. They kind of show up on Sunday and I've heard horror stories, you've heard them too, of people who were absolutely not prepared. They knew that the brethren were supporting them. They knew they loved the truth. They knew an extraordinarily low level of effort was going to be necessary for them to collect their paycheck at the beginning of the month, and did not put the work in at all. And there are other people like Zeke was alluding to who see it just as a job. And I'm just showing up and I'm cashing a check and I'm doing whatever I have to do to keep the bosses happy and that sort of thing. How do we meet in the middle? How do we get to where we are responsible in the things that we are doing? We're putting forth the effort, but we don't lose sight of our spiritual calling.
I always tell young guys, you need to prove to yourself that you're doing this because you love the Lord and you love souls. And you need to do that for a while where you're not being supported by God's people to do that. This isn't something where one day you're like, I think I'll be a preacher, so I need to make sure I go to school or I go through a program. No, you prove to yourself that the reason you want to do this work is because you believe that what the Lord's doing in the world matters and that you want to be a part of that, whether or not you're getting paid for it. And it makes it a whole lot easier to go to a group of God's people and say, hey, I love doing the work of an evangelist. Do you want to support me to do that? And rather than, hey, I want to apply for this job, and if I don't get the job, then I won't be preaching the gospel. If that's your attitude, then don't ever do it.
Well, that's kind of what happened in a way when I first started preaching. I was with a small group in New Mexico and we were looking for a preacher. And ever since the first dull, monotonous sermon I preached right after I became a Christian, I knew that it was something I wanted to develop. And that was when I had this romantic notion of what a preacher was. And I got the opportunity to do it. I got to do all the preaching and teaching for several months while we were looking for a preacher. And the congregation knew that eventually someday I wanted to do it full time. And so they just said, look, you're already doing the work. Why don't you just quit your job and let us pay you for it? And so it kind of fell into my lap, and I praise God for the way that it worked out. But think about elders. The qualifications for an elder in 1 Timothy 3 are all about a man who has already shown that he's got a track record of integrity, of leadership, of putting God first. And man, I can't think of a better characteristics for a preacher, just like Andy just said. Have you already proven, first of all, to yourself that the Lord is going to come first?
I heard one time somebody was saying that when Sewell Hall would look for somebody to work with, or somebody would come to him, that was his first question. It'd say, well, what are you doing to preach the gospel now? And when they would say, well, I don't know, or well, that's what I'm trying to find out, or whatever, he would say, well, I don't think this is going to work. The spirit that we take as Christians into the work is going to manifest the kind of person that we are, whether we get into the work or not. I think maybe preaching is going to bring out the best and the worst in people. Egotists are going to preach because they're egotists. Servants are going to preach because they're servants. It's not about how we act as preachers. It's about who we are as people, who we are as
This
Christians.
is what I've been reading.
And hopefully, at least, the attitude problems fix themselves, maybe with a little help. And the doctrinal problems certainly fix themselves. And we strive toward the goal, toward the mark for the prize. This is the first of 5, count them 5, episodes in which I plan to discuss a book I've heard about for years but never read until this summer, J.D. Tant, Texas Preacher, written by his son Yater Tant. Clearly, it is intended to be an homage to the author's father, as is appropriate, but it also pulls back the curtain a bit on the life of a preacher in general, some good, some not so good. And although times have changed, I'm not sure the preacher's life has changed so much, except I don't travel from town to town on horseback or accept hogs as payment for preaching. What do you think are the best and worst parts of your job? What has taken you by surprise, and what would you change if you could?
Anybody who's ever preached for any length of time knows that it is filled with incredibly high highs and really low lows. All of the best highs and the worst lows always involve other people. The best highs, I mean, I love those light bulb moments when somebody gets it, when they see the plan of salvation and they see God's wisdom and how he introduced it through his son, and they can't wait to join the Lord in baptism. On the other hand, when you see somebody falling away, and even when you appeal to them based on their obligation to God, they don't care. That's low.
The best part of the job is that it's not a job at all. Like, the best part of it is I get to live the life that like God designed for a servant of God to live. Like, I get to spend my time encouraging people and edifying people and having discussions with them about their spiritual life and teaching. I get supported by God's people to do that. That's amazing. What a gift it is in my life that I get to do this work. The other thing I'd say is the worst part of the job is it's not a job. And I don't get to like hang it up at the end of the day and, punch a clock and go home and forget everything about the people I care about and the people that we're working with. And maybe this is part of what you mean, Zeke. We pour our hearts and our lives into other people's lives. And when we see that work being blessed by God and God giving the increase and it going well, it's fantastic. But when you see people taken away by temptation, when you care more about their soul than they do, it rips your guts out. And I don't know that I've ever figured out how to separate the work that I do from the life that I live. I try really hard to make sure that doesn't negatively affect my family, but it's a complicated thing to have your service in this life and the work that you do in this life be your whole life. That's been the hardest thing for me.
You were mentioning 1 Corinthians 3, or referring to it anyway, God giving the increase. I was thinking the same passage a few verses forward, I think verse 17, where it talks about how if anyone will go into this field of work, and he may be building a temple with gold and silver and precious stones and have this tremendous temple that he's able to build. And somebody else is building with wood and hay and stubble and probably knows the entire time that thing's going to burn up one of these days. And how frustrating and aggravating that is. And the idea of being saved through fire. Not to sound just too egotistical or elitist or whatever, but I'm not sure that a non-preacher appreciates that like we do. When you invest your heart and spirit and your life and your blood and sweat into a work and it just burns up, having God pat you on the head and say, well, you're going to heaven anyway, that is not entirely comforting. You know, it still hurts. It's still fire. You know, we did our best. We can lay our heads on the pillow and sleep without guilt, but that doesn't mean we'll sleep. It hurts when bad things happen, when people disappoint you. And I've been in works where I felt like I left the group on the surface anyway, maybe even worse than when I got there. And maybe that's my imagination, maybe that's guilt or whatever, but certainly on the surface it looked worse. And what a horrible feeling that is, to think that you were presiding over this train wreck. It's the worst feeling there is. And maybe it's fair that it be that way, because like you guys were saying before, the flip side of that is so wonderful and so tremendous when you, not that we're taking credit for it, but we were there any more than we're taking credit for the disaster. We were there and we were helping, we were urging people along, and we may have had some kind of impact, and things worked out so well. That is just an incredible blessing for us, and you can't have the one without the other. When Job comes up in conversation and you know, he loses everything, you know, I'll counsel people about in times of loss or disaster or whatever. Inevitably, I'll say something along those lines. The reason that you hurt so bad right now is because you felt so good before. The reason that you miss what you have is because you loved what you had. And if you hadn't had it in the first place, if you hadn't loved it, you wouldn't be hurting now. You can't have the one without the other. And so, you know, if you feel like you're going to be able to get into this and it's all going to be fireworks and roses and such, that's not life. That's not even not preaching. That's not life. You have to be prepared to accept the bad with the good. And there's going to be plenty of both.
One of the, you probably heard this, somebody said, pain is the price you pay for having loved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely true in a preacher's life. And that's why I think it's so important for anybody, but especially preachers, to have somebody that they can talk to, somebody that will understand the peculiarities of the preaching life, and someone that they can just vent to. And it can be a mentor. It can be someone who's not particularly another preacher, but just somebody that you feel you can be completely honest with. You know, when I was reading through J.D. Tant's biography, there's a name that pops up from time to time, Joe Warlick. And the implication is that Tant was very close to this guy and was able to talk to him. That has been, for me as a preacher, just inestimable. The idea that I can have somebody that I don't have to have all the answers around, somebody I can just talk to about the pain that I'm going through, or the disappointment or the frustration or whatever it might be, as well as the highs, the elation that I sometimes feel. Having somebody who understands that without being judgmental, but is still going to offer me some wisdom that maybe I hadn't thought about before. I can't measure how valuable that's been to me in the past.
So Hal, you were talking about maybe it's difficult for some to understand that illustration that Paul uses about planting, watering, building, and then, you know, fire coming through and testing what you've built. Some people do completely understand that, like moms. Moms get that. Like if you have children and you've poured your life into your kids and you want to see them do well and you want to see them turn out right, you've cared more about them than they cared about themselves most of the years you took care of them. Somebody like that understands the joy of seeing what you've done flourish, and then the heartbreak of seeing what you've done not work the way that you hoped. I'd say it's not just moms, it's any Christian who's taken seriously loving people in the world. Like if you've tried to share the gospel, if you've tried to help somebody along in their life that struggled, if you've become a friend to somebody who you've really tried to show them the light of the Lord and the love of the Lord, if you've poured your heart out into somebody, I think people understand what it's like to see that either turn out or not turn out. And going to what Zeke said, some of the people I've surrounded myself with in my life aren't necessarily fellow preachers the same way that I'm a preacher, but they are fellow servants of God, sometimes even in this congregation, who just have an extraordinary love for souls and constantly are trying to help people grow. Some of my best conversations are with them. not necessarily a guy who sits in an office and reads books and preaches sermons, but people who genuinely have loved other people and loved souls and poured their lives into those situations. I've found great companionship with people like that.
One of the things I liked about the book about Tant was how he was all in, even when it was discouraging. When you read through that book, he's very open and honest about how his brethren failed him from time to time, right? They went back on their word. Sometimes they attacked him, but he found a way to make sure that he understood that it doesn't matter about people. What matters is what people hear. What matters is what I do for the kingdom. And being all in, I mean, even with his wives, I mean, he had two wives. One he was only married to for a short time, the other for the rest of his life. Even when he proposed to them, it was all very matter of fact, right? He said, you've got to be prepared for the difficulty of being my wife. It's not going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be difficult because the Lord comes first, even before you, he told them. And man, you talk about somebody being all in. I read the book years ago and I read it again recently because Hal said I had to, but it just opened my eyes again to how those pioneer preachers have paved the way for us today, who in a lot of ways have it a lot easier than they ever did. But the call to our utter and complete submission to our vocation is the same.
I'll dispute the idea that I forced Zeke to read the book in the first place. But along the same lines, though, one of the things that really struck me is how easy it was for Tant to quit everything except the Lord. You know, everything except his marriage and the gospel and his vocation. He would move from county to county, state to state, all over the place, trying to find a way to have a living for his family while he went out and preached. I'm not sure that's a lifestyle that I am advocating, and it's certainly not one that my wife is advocating for me. But the idea of absolute commitment to one thing and virtually no commitment at all to these other things, at least as far as they interfere with spiritual things. I don't know that I have that kind of commitment. I don't know that a lot of brethren that I know have that kind of commitment.
Think about Tant's motivation. He already had a job as a Methodist preacher. And then when he obeyed the gospel, it must have rocked his world, because the restoration movement at that time was, I mean, still pretty young. He was less than 100 years old probably. And he completely changed, not just that he had to make personally, but that he had to make to his teaching and his preaching and everything. And it was a time when the things that he would go out and preach and teach were strange to the ears of those people that he would be talking to. So there was already a kind of a set of built-in obstacles that he was going to be having. But he looked at those obstacles as opportunities, because again, for him, the most important thing was the message.
That's one life of one man. And there are countless people who've served God in their generation and in the place where they lived, who've put their heart and soul into the work that they've done for the Lord, who have no recognition. There's no books written about them. There's no stories told about them. We as preachers have to be content with that. I may never be known. I may never have a book written about me. But I would just say it's not just something about preachers. It's just about Christians. Again, some of the best evangelists I've ever known aren't people who stand in pulpits. We don't get to choose what generation we live in. We don't get to choose all the time where we end up being born or where we live. Sometimes circumstances in our life don't present themselves where we can live the life of a J.D. Tant. The question is, can we do it where we're at in the time that we live, doing the best work we can for whatever people are around us? In some ways, I think this goes back to something Zeke was saying. Maybe there's people who think about, the vocation of preaching and they kind of romanticize it in their head. And that's where we go back to just start serving God right where you are with whatever opportunities you have. Be all in with it, whether or not you ever make your living with it or not, or move around or don't move around. Like, there's always souls around us that need to be taught and God's people that need to be encouraged.
To me, one of the most motivating sections of scripture is that part at the end of Hebrews 11, where there's this great unnamed crowd of people who went through all kinds of stuff. And maybe the names of some of these people were known to the original audience. I mean, there's some allusion to maybe people that they had known, but the Hebrew writer doesn't give us the names. He just tells us what they endured for God. And as far as what Andy said, it's not that there may be books written about me. There won't be. But there's only one book that matters, right? The book of life. And that's the one I want to be found in.
I asked if there was something that about the job that you would change if you could. Is there something that if you had the power to change that you would?
Nothing real, just fantasy stuff. I wish I could be in 2 places at once or 10 places at once. Your heart is pulled in so many ways, and there's so many people you want to help. As I get older and I know more Christians in more places that ask for my help or my assistance or for me to visit and encourage or whatever, I just always wish I could be in more than one place. But most of it's perspective for me. If there's something I feel like I wish this would be different in my circumstance or this would change, that's part of when I go back to what we were discussing in the first segment. What's my attitude right now? This isn't about me and, whether or not I like this work or whether this is going the way I hoped right now. I know what my work is and I need to just keep doing it.
If I could change one thing, it would be that I could make people do what I say they ought to do. But that's never going to happen, right? Because I can't do that, it comes back to me. I've got to change myself. I've got to learn to be more persuasive with the message. That's what I really want to motivate people to change is the message. And I think if preaching has done anything for me, it's helped me to become, first of all, a Bible student, because I never was one. And then secondly, as time goes on, I hope I'm becoming a better Bible student. And I still learn a lot about my work, and I hope I'm not too dense to be able to find ways to present the message more persuasively, even to people who have heard it a million times. But yeah, if there was one superpower I had, it would be to make people do what I say. I can't even make my kids do that.
Yeah. God doesn't make his kids do that either. So
It's a challenging job, but the challenging part of it is the good part of it. It's
This
not
is what I've been playing.
People are going to have their own decisions to make, and my superpower is never going to come true. So what I do with preaching is up to me.
When Tracy and I first saw Chronicles of Crime, we knew beyond a doubt it would be a hit with our family, and it has been. In Chronicles of Crime, you are a team of detectives. Clues are out there. You can actually look around the crime scene in 3D, interview witnesses, consult experts, and more. But you have to know where to look. You have to recognize the important bits of information when they show up. You have to recognize what is and is not a reliable witness. You can succeed, but it's work. That's not the greatest segue ever, but I don't have any preaching games, although there are preaching games. I just don't have any of them, so I'm doing the best I can in this segment. The question for us here is, what is our biggest obstacle to success? What keeps us from getting to where we want to be as preachers, and how do we go about overcoming it?
I think over the years that I've been preaching, which now is 25 years, the thing that's been hardest for me is what you just said, is how do I even measure success? Like, what's the right way to measure it? There's no metric for that. If I was doing a different job, you could say, hey, look, that's the house I built, or, that's the project I did. It's been hard for me when the job is the development of people's souls and the growth of an organic body of believers that's constantly changing because people move or people come and go, people get lost, people get found. How do I measure the success of the work that I'm doing? That starts playing a lot of tricks on my head. So I'd say sometimes the biggest obstacle for me is sort of that voice in my head that says, you're not doing this right. You need to quit doing this. Somebody else needs to do it. Just give up. Partly because I don't always know how to measure success. I've learned over the years that I can't look at it from that perspective. I have to think about God's going to be the one who's in charge of the harvest. God's going to do whatever he does with the planting and the watering that we do. So am I doing the best work I can in this moment with this thing? So that's one answer.
We like to measure success with hard and fast numbers, right? We even have a tote board in our foyers for that kind of stuff. We want to know how many people showed up, how many baptisms we had, how many dollars we're drawing in. We want numbers. But that's not how Jesus measured success. What he did was he made sure people heard the most important message that they needed to hear, and he let them decide whether or not they were going to succeed. If there's going to be a way that my ministry is ever going to have success, it's going to have to, I keep coming back to me. It's going to have to start with me. I'm going to have to realize the importance of my own personal growth and study. I'm going to have to realize my inadequacies, and I'm going to have to realize my potentials as well. And maybe sometimes I don't use my potential as well as the Lord sees it, but I've got to realize that there is nothing that is going to be as successful as just getting the message to people that need to hear it.
If like the Gospel of John is any indication, Jesus would far rather preach to one attentive person than a crowd of thousands. That's certainly the impression that's left in the scriptures. When he preaches to one, he's engaged, he's connected, he's on task, and he'll stay there as long as the other person wants to stay there. If the crowd gets too big, he starts driving people off. There's too many people here. We need to cull our ranks almost, which is just the opposite approach of what I want to do, what I imagine myself doing. Surely bigger is better. Bigger's got to be better. How could bigger possibly not be better? But it's not, according to Jesus anyway. Our vision of success, like Andy was saying, success is vague. In fact, I'm not sure you can measure success except for just on a personal level. It's not necessarily how's the work going, because that's always what I ask. It's one of the first things I ask preachers when I get together, like, how's the work going? Well, are we really more just saying, how are you doing? How is your life? How is your personal growth? Because if I am drawn closer to the Lord, if I'm doing good work and it's producing great results versus not producing great results, that's outside. I don't have any control over that, or very little control. If I can pursue success in my own life, if I can be the kind of light I ought to be, if I can be the preacher that I ought to be, if I can be the Bible student that I ought to be, then God takes care of the growth. God gives the growth, like Andy's saying.
It can be tempting to look at success as merely a numbers game.
Right.
But we can also be susceptible to letting ourselves be deceived by the opinions of a few tactless hotheads from time to time. To me, success just comes down to, am I following Jesus? Am I showing the right example to people that they need to see? Because I can't do anything about anybody else except point them to the one who will help them have success.
Hal, you were saying sometimes you ask the question, how's the work going? I usually interpret that question as not just how am I personally, but what's like the congregation, how's the body of Christ where you are, like what's going on. But when you think about like the letters to the 7 churches of Asia in the book of Revelation, and you think about Jesus writing to these churches and their situations, a lot of times perceptions are wrong about that. You could say, oh, things are going great. We got a lot of people around, people are engaged, and there's all these good things. And Jesus might say, yeah, but you're poor and miserable and blind and naked. What if you happen to be the preacher for Smyrna? And the idea was, hey, everything's about to get really bad. You guys are poor, you're going through hard times, and it's going to get worse. And the best thing you can do is just be faithful till you all die. Did that church in Smyrna, did it end up continuing after that, or was that the end of the congregation? What if you're a preacher for a congregation that's dying because the town's drying up and jobs are disappearing and people are moving out and there's depression and difficulty, and you're watching all this fall apart, and you think, well, like you said earlier, Hal, this place got worse while I was here. Well, we don't know that for sure. It may have been our faithful duty to love those people and strengthen what remains. And like Zeke said, make sure that these people don't get lost in a discouraging world. Praise God for people that do that work. So again, I go back to part of the obstacle, I think, for me is knowing how to measure all of that. do I happen to be in the kingdom for such a time as this? All my dreams about what my preaching life would look like, I was going to make a church grow, I was going to help them reach these certain goals. That might not be my lot. That might not be how I show myself faithful to God.
That's a real interesting point, especially with regard to Revelation. If you have not preached to 7 churches, which one are you? Sermon, you're the only preacher that I know that hasn't. It's we all go through this. Are you going to be the church that is known worldwide for standing against error, and you're going to pat yourself on the back for that, and then the Lord tells you that you've lost your first love? Or you measure by, we have a lot of people in the pews, like in Sardis, we have a really good contribution, like they probably had in Laodicea. Where is the success found? What are we calling success? And I think that's what all three of us are coming back to this same notion, the idea that success, as people tend to define it, doesn't really work with regard to the Lord's kingdom, which shouldn't take us by surprise, because so many other things that we use to describe success in the world don't apply. A proper leader in the world is not necessarily a proper leader in the church. A proper teaching technique in the world is not necessarily a proper teaching technique in the Lord. What we always find ourselves doing is coming back to Jesus, keeping our eye on Jesus, doing his work, and letting him give the growth. And this has been I say it has been a growth opportunity for me. It actually continues to be. The idea of taking your eyes off of your own work and your own legacy and your own impression in the minds of your brethren and people across the world, just simplifying things. It's not about what people are going to say about me at my funeral. It's not about whether the church is going to be more numerically large or financially stable or whatever after I leave than it was when I came. Did I serve the Lord in this place? Did I draw close to the Lord personally, encourage other people to do the same? Taking responsibility for the things that are in my wheelhouse and not trying to take responsibility for things that are outside of it.
You'd mentioned at the beginning of the segment the game that you and your family enjoy, Chronicles of Crime. Is that it?
Yes.
I don't know anything about it. I've never even heard of it before you mentioned it, but I like, crime mysteries. And it sounds like in the game, you're trying to solve a crime, right?
Right.
I like murder mysteries, and I watch a lot of them on TV. And it seems to me that in a way, that's kind of what our work is. It's about solving a murder mystery. The one who was murdered was Christ. If I get one person to stop thinking about what the world needs or what their spouse needs or what their kids need, and think to themselves, hey, it was my sin that put Jesus on the cross. It was because of me that he died. Then we can start to help people realize the proper response to that. And getting people to respond to the Lord in the right way, that's success.
I would say fatigue and weariness is an obstacle for me. But I think a lot of that comes from the emotional toll that the work takes, when you invest and when you care and when you're concerned about the things that are going on, it can get really tiring, which I think is why scripture so often says, let's not grow weary in doing good. Part of that, again, is practicing the disciplines that scripture tells us to practice. Paul, again, writing from Philippians, like Zeke brought up earlier, whatever's good, whatever's noble, dwell on these things. There's all kinds of terrible stuff to think about and look at. You can look at your critics, you can look at the difficulties of the nation that you're living in and all the division that's going on, or you can have a better eye to see that God's doing amazing things around us.
On the topic of fatigue, allow me to digress a little bit for the benefit of those who are listening. I had absolute fits getting these two people together at the same time. We went on and on for weeks trying to get this thing to work. And I think that it's what Andy was talking about. These people are so busy. They are working so consistently and steadily throughout the week. That's the nature of the job. And it can be fatiguing. It can be tiring, mentally fatiguing, even more than physically. There's no shame in taking a little bit of time and recharging. Robert Turner's a famous hunter. He'd go out, with his gun out into the woods and stay there for weeks and shoot stuff and or not shoot stuff, as the case may be, and come back and get recharged. That's an important thing. The Sabbath day was given to the Israel of old for a reason. You're not supposed to be working all the time, and that's with preachers as well.
There's a lot of wisdom in what Jesus told his disciples. Come away by yourselves for a little while. There's all the vacation time that the elders allow me to have, I will take if my schedule allows, because it's important. It's important to come away and kind of decompress and recharge.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Please consider subscribing to the audio and or video versions, and better yet, sharing them through word of mouth or on social media. Feel free to reach out to me through my website, www.halhammons.com, or through Facebook and Instagram. Criticisms, corrections, and encouragement are always welcome. Until next time, be strong in the Lord, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammons, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.